Let me begin by concurring with the remarks of Senator Cardin. Tom Perez will make an excellent Secretary of Labor, and I strongly support his nomination. Mr. President, it is no great secret that the United States Congress is currently held in very low esteem by the American people, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think that the major reason, perhaps, is in the midst of so many serious problems facing our country, the American people perceive that we are just not addressing those issues, and they are right. Regardless of what your political point of view may be, we're looking at a middle class that is disappearing. Are we addressing that issue? No. Poverty is just extraordinarily high. Are we moving aggressively to address that? No, we're not. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, enormously bureaucratic and wasteful. Are we addressing that? No, we're not. But the issue that I want to talk about today, maybe more clearly than any other issue in terms of our neglect, is the issue of global warming. Mr. President, at a time when virtually the entire scientific community, the people who spend their lives studying climate change, tell us that global warming is real, that it is significantly caused by human activity, and that it is already doing great damage, it is beyond comprehension that this Senate, this Congress, is not even discussing that enormously important issue on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Where is the debate? Where is the legislation on what might be considered the most significant planetary crisis that we face? Mr. President, I fear very much that our children and our grandchildren who will reap the pain from our neglect will never forgive us for not moving in the way that we should be moving. Now, Mr. President, I understand that some of my colleagues, including my good friend Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma, who I like very, very much, that some of my Republican friends especially believe that global warming is a hoax. They believe that global warming is something, it is a hoax perpetrated by Al Gore, the United Nations, the Hollywood elite. This is what people like Jim Inhofe actually believe. Well, I have to say to my good friend, Mr. Inhofe, that he is dead wrong. Global warming is not just a crisis that will impact us in years to come. It is impacting us right now, and it is a crisis that we must address. In fact, global warming is the most serious environmental crisis facing not just the United States of America, but our entire planet. And we cannot continue to ignore that reality. Science News reports that cities in America matched or broke at least 29,000 high-temperature records just last year. According to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, 2012 was the warmest year ever recorded for the contiguous United States. It was the hottest year ever recorded in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Louisville, Kentucky, and in my hometown of Burlington, Vermont, and other cities across the nation. Our oceans also are warming quickly and catastrophically. A new study found that North Atlantic waters last summer were the warmest in 159 years of record keeping, and the United Nations World Meteorological Organization in May issued a warning about the loss of Arctic sea ice and extreme weather that is increasingly shaped by climate change, end of quote. And scientists are now warning that the Arctic may experience entirely ice-free summers within 2 years. Let me repeat that. The Arctic may experience entirely ice-free summers within 2 years. Scientists are also reporting that carbon dioxide levels have reached a dangerous milestone level of 400 parts per million, a level not seen on the planet Earth for millions of years. In fact, the world's leading scientists unequivocally agree. A recent review of the scientific literature found that more than 98% of peer-reviewed scientific studies on climate change supports the conclusion that human activity is causing climate change. Among scientists, says the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the most important and prestigious scientific organizations in our country and the world. And this is what they say, and I quote, "Among scientists, there is now overwhelming agreement based on multiple lines of scientific evidence that global climate change is real, it is happening right now, and it will have broad impacts on society," end of quote. And that's from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Mr. President, we are not into speculation, and we are not into debate. The conclusion is there. Global warming is real. It is happening right now. It is impacting the United States of America and the world right now, and it will only get worse if we do not act. I mean, the examples of that are so numerous that one can go on hour after hour, but let me just give you just a few. Extreme weather events are now occurring with increased frequency and increased intensity. That's extreme weather disturbances. In 2011 and 2012, the United States experienced an extraordinary 25, quote-unquote, billion-dollar disasters. 25 separate billion-dollar disasters, so-called because they each caused more than $1 billion worth of damage. This is unprecedented. NOAA's Climate Extremes Index, which is a system for assessing a wide range of extreme weather. That includes extreme temperatures, extreme drought, extreme precipitation, tropical storms. NOAA's Climate Extremes Index tells us that 2012 was characterized by the second most extreme climate conditions ever recorded. A number of colleagues make the point, they come up and they say, well, Senator Sanders and others, dealing with climate change is going to be expensive. Transforming our energy system away from fossil fuels is going to be expensive. Well, they're right. It is going to be expensive, but the question that we have to ask is, compared to what? Compared to doing nothing? Compared to conducting business as usual? Compared to allowing a significant increase in droughts, in floods, in extreme weather disturbances? Compared to that, acting now and acting boldly is cost effective. Yes, it will be expensive, but it will be a lot less expensive, cause a lot less human pain and less human death than allowing global warming to continue unmitigated. Mr. President, the cost, and this is an interesting point, especially I think for my conservative friends who look to the business community for information and for analysis. The cost of insured catastrophe and extreme weather events has been trending upward for 30 years. This is a very significant economic issue. Munich Re, the largest reinsurance company in the world, that's the company that insures the insurance companies, has already documented a five-fold increase in extreme weather events in North America since 1980. And they keep track of this stuff pretty closely because for them, this is a dollars and cents issue. They are the ones who help others pay out the benefits when there is extreme damage as a result of storms and floods, etc. And they calculated, Munich recalculated, that the economic cost of damages due to natural catastrophes in the United States exceeded $139 billion in 2012 alone. So when you talk about money and you talk about expense and you talk about cost, let's understand that we are already racking up record-breaking costs in terms of dealing with the extreme weather disturbances we have seen in recent years. The Allianz Insurance Company noted bluntly last fall that, and I quote, "Climate change represents a threat to our business," end of quote, an insurance company. But it's not just the insurance companies. It's the businesses that are seeing insurance become unaffordable when they're hit with floods and other disasters. And that comes right out of their bottom lines. Global warming, of course, is closely tied to drought and fire as well. Last year's drought, affecting 2/3 of the United States, was the worst in half a century. But the United States is not the only country on Earth being impacted. We obviously pay attention to what's happening within our borders. But global warming is having huge impacts all over this planet. Brazil is experiencing its worst drought in 50 years. It is directly affecting over 10 million people in that country, and because of impacts to wheat farmers, the price of flour rose over 700%. Australia just experienced a 4-month heat wave with severe wildfires, record-setting temperatures, and torrential rains and flooding, causing over $2 billion in damages in that country. In recent years, other parts of the world, Russia, China, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe, have also suffered severe heat waves and droughts with substantial impacts to agriculture, communities, and their economic well-being. Just weeks ago, as everybody in America knows, we watched as fires raged across parts of the western United States, including the massive and dangerously explosive West Fork fire in southwestern Colorado. And let me take a moment now to acknowledge the deaths of 19 unbelievably brave firefighters from Prescott, Arizona, who lost their lives trying to protect their neighbors and property near Phoenix. Wildfires like these appear to be increasingly common. In fact, the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Thomas Tidwell, recently reported to Congress that America's wildfire season lasts 2 months longer than it did 40 years ago and burns twice as much land as it did then because of the hotter, drier conditions from climate change. Last year's extraordinary wildfires burned more than 9 million acres of land, according to the National Interagency Fire Center, and Chief Tidwell also warned about the increasing frequency of monster fires. Monster fires. Mr. President, when we're talking about drought, it is not just some kind of abstraction. When drought occurs, agriculture suffers. When agriculture suffers, the cost of food goes up. And in parts of the world where people have very little money, this is catastrophic. And one of the points made by the CIA, the Department of Defense, many of our intelligence agencies, when they talk about national security issues, they often put at the top of the list, or close to the top of the list, global warming, because they understand that drought and floods means that people don't have the food they need, people don't have the water they need, people are going to migrate from one area to another. It is going to cause tension. It is going to cause conflict. So global warming is also a major, major national security issue. Mr. President, one of the issues we don't talk enough about, and I know Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island does talk about it, is the impact that global warming is having on our oceans, driving fish to deeper, cooler waters, threatening the fishing industry and food security. In the Pacific Northwest, for example, according to NOAA and as reported by USA Today just this spring, shellfish farmers on the West Coast are increasingly experiencing collapses in both hatcheries and natural ecosystems. Extreme weather and rising sea levels also threaten people across the planet. More than 31 million people fled their homes just last year because of disasters related to floods and storms tied to climate change, according to a number of sources. And climate change will create, in years to come, even larger numbers of what we call climate refugees, as low-lying countries lose landmass to rising seas and to desertification, consuming once fertile territory. In northern India, nearly 6,000 people are dead or missing from devastating floods and landslides just last month. Closer to home, Hurricane Sandy alone displaced 750,000 people in the United States and is costing us up to $60 billion federal dollars in helping those communities rebuild. Permanent displacement is already occurring in the United States. In other words, people are permanently losing their residences. The Army Corps of Engineers predicted that the entire village of Newtok, Alaska, could be underwater by 2017, and more than 180 additional native Alaskan villages are at risk. Parts of Alaska are literally vanishing, and scientists believe that entire U.S. cities or parts of coastal cities are in danger of being flooded as well. In fact, experts are telling us that cities like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, New York, New Orleans, and others will face a growing threat of partial submersion within just a few decades as sea levels and storm surge levels continue to climb, and that entire countries, small island nations like Micronesia and the Maldives, and large nations like Indonesia face similar risks. Ironically, rising sea levels are even threatening key oil industry infrastructure. For example, scientists at NOAA are estimating that portions of Louisiana State Highway 1 will be inundated by rising high tides 30 times a year. Highway 1 provides the only road access to a port servicing nearly 1 out of every 5 barrels of U.S. oil supply. Mr. President, what's my point? My point is that we are facing a horrendous planetary crisis. We cannot continue to ignore it. We must act, and we must act now. Mr. President, in my view, the first thing that we must do is we must not make a terribly dangerous situation, i.e. global warming and greenhouse gas emissions, even worse than it is right now. We must break our dependence on fossil fuels, not expand it. We must modernize our grid and transform our energy system to one based on sustainable energy sources, and we must move aggressively toward energy efficiency. And in that process, we must reject the Keystone XL pipeline proposal, which would dramatically increase carbon dioxide emissions, according to the EPA, by the equivalent of 18.7 million metric tons per year, releasing as much as 935 million metric tons over 50 years. In other words, the planet faces a crisis right now. Why would we think for 1 second about making that crisis even worse? Further, Congress needs to end wasteful subsidies for the industries that are causing climate change. According to a report by DBL Investors, between 1918 and 2009, the oil and gas industry received government subsidies to the tune of $446 billion, to say nothing of state subsidies, which have benefited from decades' worth of backroom political deals. In other words, why are we continue to subsidize those industries that are helping to bring devastating damage to our planet? Thirdly, even though fossil fuels are the most expensive fuels on Earth, the fossil fuel industry for too long has shifted these enormous costs onto the public, walking away with billions in profits, while the American people have to bear the real costs of rising seas, monster storms, devastating droughts, heat waves, and other extreme weather. So when people tell you that coal or oil are cheap, what they are forgetting about are the social costs in terms of infrastructure damage and in terms of human health. These fuels are not cheap. As we transform our energy system away from fossil fuels, we must finally begin pricing carbon pollution emissions so the polluters themselves begin carrying the costs instead of passing them on to our children and grandchildren. And I am proud to have joined with Senator Barbara Boxer, the chairperson of the Environment Committee in the Senate, to introduce the Climate Protection Act earlier this year. Our bill establishes a fee on carbon pollution emissions, an approach endorsed by people all across the political spectrum, including conservatives like George Shultz, Nobel laureate economist Gary Becker, Mitt Romney's former economic advisor Gregory McHugh, former Reagan advisor Art Laffer, former Republican Congressman Bob Inglis, and others. Our bill does a number of things, and one of the things it does is return 60% of the revenue raised directly back to taxpayers in order to address increased fuel costs. It puts money, substantial sums of money, to support sustainable energy research, weatherizing homes, job creation, helping manufacturing businesses save money through energy efficiency and deficit reduction. What this does do is it begins the process of transforming our energy system. By imposing a fee on carbon, it de-incentivizes fossil fuel. By putting money into energy efficiency and sustainable energy, it helps us move in a very different and healthier direction. Mr. President, let me just conclude by saying this, going back to the point that I made when we started. The American people are shaking their head at what goes on in Washington. This country faces enormous problems, economic problems, social problems, and I would argue that in global warming we face a planetary crisis. The American people want us to act. It is incomprehensible that week after week, month after month, year after year, we are not addressing the issue of global warming. And I hope that sooner than later we bring serious legislation to the floor of the Senate. We have that debate, and we do what that planetary crisis requires, and that is transform our energy system, move away from fossil fuel, move to energy efficiency and sustainable energy.